The wind had a bitter edge that October afternoon in Springfield, Ohio. Franklin Elementary School sat on the edge of town, its brick walls faded and scuffed by decades of Midwest winters. Parents always said it was safe. Kids played in the fenced playground, surrounded by tall maples, their leaves ablaze in orange and red, drifting in lazy spirals to the cracked asphalt. Teachers chatted quietly on benches, while the children shrieked in delight, the swing chains clanging as they twisted higher. It seemed so normal. No one watching from the street would suspect the undercurrent of worry in the staff lounge, where safety meeting posters hung crooked on the wall, a silent reminder of how easily things could go wrong. Laura Riley sat in her small gray sedan parked across from the school, eyes on the playground fence. She watched her daughter Emma's bright pink jacket as it flashed among the other children playing tag. Laura liked to see Emma happy the way her long hair floated behind her as she ran laughing. Laura's fingers drummed on the steering wheel, mind restless with tomorrow's grocery list and the evening's work emails. She had a meeting later and was trying to decide if she could trust the babysitter for an extra hour. She glanced back at the playground. Emma was gone from her sightline. She craned her neck but told herself not to worry. The kids always darted behind the equipment. The recess aide, a young woman named Cynthia with pale skin and coffee in hand, paced along the gate. She felt the bite of the wind in her thin jacket. She hated October duty. The children bunched along the slide, a few arguing over whose turn it was. She turned to scold them and calm things down. For what felt like half a minute, she had her back to the gate that latched with a stubborn metal hook. She would replay that moment later in her mind until she felt sick. When she turned back around, she scanned the yard, automatically counting heads. Something nagged at her, though she could not name it. A silence among the screams. Inside the school office, the secretary clicked through spreadsheets, the old computer monitor flickering in the gloom of the cloudy day. She sipped stale coffee, wondering if she could sneak another smoke break before dismissal. The phone rang twice. She picked up with the fake, sweet voice that always made her feel like an actress. There was no hint that she would soon be dialing 911. She heard the first panicked shouts coming from the yard about a child who could not be found. The words muffled through the glass, but unmistakable in their urgency. She set the phone down with a shaking hand and called the principal's extension. On the playground, Cynthia called out Emma's name in a rising pitch, her face turning pink with fear. A few kids slowed their games to stare. She jogged along the fence line, rattling the gate to see if it was secure. It moved a fraction more than it should have. She squinted at the latch, which looked wrong, like it had been scraped or recently forced. She felt sweat trickle down her spine, despite the cold. She shouted for the other aide. Within minutes, they had the children lined up in a confused and frightened clump, counting them 3 times. Emma Riley was gone. Laura left her car when she heard the shouting. Her first thought was some dumb fight between kids. Then she saw Cynthia crying, and the principal trying to hold her by the shoulders. The parents nearby exchanged glances. The feeling of dread grew like an oil slick in Laura's chest. She ran toward the fence, her boots crunching leaves. She called Emma's name in a voice that cracked. The wind whipped the branches overhead. The sky felt too wide, too empty. She heard her own breath rasping and realized she was sobbing. Police arrived in a blur of lights. 2 cruisers parked at Engel's doors, open radios squawking. Officers spread out immediately, one interviewing Cynthia, the other asking Laura questions she barely understood. She gave Emma's age and height and her outfit: pink jacket, blue jeans with flower patches, light-up sneakers that blinked with every step. Laura felt nauseous listing the details, imagining each in the dirt or in the road. The playground fell silent, but for the wind. The children had been taken inside. The teachers cried quietly against the brick wall, huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. The first searchers arrived that afternoon. Volunteers from nearby homes, teachers who refused to leave neighbors who walked the fence line with grim faces. Police dogs sniffed along the edge of the field and the woods that bordered the school. They barked excitedly at one spot near the gate, but then lost the scent. Officers frowned, talking into radios. A helicopter was called in its rotors, beating the cold air to shreds. Laura could not stop pacing along the fence, arms crossed tightly, mouth pulled into a straight line that refused to relax. By dusk, the temperature dropped sharply. Floodlights cast long shadows that made the slides and swings look like monstrous claws on the ground. Officers spoke to news crews in hushed, rehearsed tones about every effort and ongoing investigation. Laura refused to go home, even when Mark Riley arrived and tried to talk her down. Their marriage had been strained before, but something broke that night as they fought quietly, angrily under the lights, while strangers watched them. She would never forgive how he snapped at her to get a grip that Emma needed her to think straight. In the early morning hours, the search was called off temporarily for safety. The volunteers were sent home, shivering eyes red from cold and tears. Police tape flapped in the wind at the school gate. Laura sat in her car, refusing to leave engine off keys in her lap. She pressed Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit to her chest. She stared out the windshield at the empty playground, willing her daughter to run back out from behind the slide. She whispered Emma's name over and over, like a prayer, her breath fogging the glass. No one answered her. News spread quickly through Springfield. Local channels ran the story all night. Missing posters were printed by dawn. Emma's second-grade school photo, grainy but bright. Neighbors taped them to every pole and gas station window. The town fell into a collective hush. Parents held their children closer at bus stops. Teachers refused to let kids out without tighter supervision. The playground fence was examined inch by crime scene teams. They found a faint smear on the latch. It was pinkish-brown, so small it almost went unnoticed. A technician gently scraped it into a bag. He could not tell Laura what it meant, only that it would be tested. Laura watched them from the hood of her car, arms wrapped around herself. She felt outside her own body, like a ghost watching the living. The day had dawned bright and clear, cruelly beautiful, with frost sparkling on the grass. It made no sense. The world should have stopped. She did not notice Mark had left until someone told her. She felt numb, thinking of the empty bedroom at home, with the rainbow curtains and the stuffed animals lined up on the bed. Emma's favorite book lay open on the floor where she had dropped it the day before, the last time she would be truly safe. Franklin Elementary closed for 2 days, but it did not matter. No one felt safe anymore. Parents hesitated to send their kids back when it reopened. Laura refused to leave town. She slept on the couch with her clothes on her phone, clutched in her hand, in case it rang with good news. She watched the news obsessively. When they showed her on TV, red-eyed and hollow-cheeked begging for Emma's return, she barely recognized herself. She sounded older. She sounded like someone who had lost everything. The next morning brought a relentless cold that settled in the bones of everyone who gathered at Franklin Elementary. Police cars lined the street with their lights flashing silently in the gray dawn. Laura stood at the fence, gripping the cold metal until her fingers ached. Eyes locked on the spot where Emma had last been seen. Volunteers from the neighborhood arrived, carrying thermoses of coffee and wearing orange vests handed out by deputies. They divided into groups, maps pinned to squad car hoods, voices low and serious as they coordinated their plans. The air smelled of wet leaves and exhaust fumes as dozens of people spread into the fields and wooded edges behind the school. Dogs barked, straining at their leashes' noses pressed to the frosted grass. Officers led searches along the creek that curved behind the property, its muddy banks slick with fallen leaves. Laura followed them despite warnings to stay back, her eyes scanning every branch and shadow. She lost track of time as she pushed through the underbrush, twigs catching in her hair, her breath visible in the frigid air. She called Emma's name again and again until her voice cracked. At one point she fell to her knees in the mud, palms sinking into the cold earth, sobs breaking loose. A deputy helped her up carefully, avoiding her eyes. They walked back to the command post without speaking. Mark stood there, looking hollowed out, face gray with worry and lack of sleep. He rubbed his jaw roughly, watching officers' radio for updates. When Laura approached, he barely reacted. The anger from the night before had drained out of him, replaced with blank exhaustion. They stood side by side without touching, listening, as the lead detective updated them in careful words about the grid search. He assured them that nothing had been found yet, which he insisted meant hope remained. Laura wanted to scream at him, but the words stuck in her throat. She swallowed them like stones. A church across the street opened its doors to volunteers, offering hot soup and a place to warm up. The local news trucks parked in the lot, reporters filming their segments against the backdrop of searchers streaming in and out. Microphones captured the worry on everyone's faces, the trembling voices of people who had known Emma since she was a toddler. Laura refused to go inside. She paced the sidewalk until her legs ached every time she sat down, feeling the urge to leap up and search again. She hated the quiet moments when panic flooded in, and she imagined Emma alone and afraid in the cold. Police began interviewing neighbors door to door, knocking with gloved hands on faded wooden doors. Some homeowners were defensive, annoyed at the disruption. Others broke down crying at the thought of a missing child so close to home. One woman brought out cookies she had baked in a frenzy and tried to hand them to the officers. Another swore she had seen a white van circling the school the day before. Detectives scribbled her statement carefully, but Laura could see in their faces the doubt settling in. Too many details, too late. Still, they wrote it all down, determined to check every lead, no matter how small. Mark spent hours at the police station answering questions about Emma's usual routes and friends. He was asked again and again about the day she disappeared, what time he had left work, whether he had seen anything suspicious. His face tightened at the repeated questions, voice growing clipped and angry. Laura sat next to him, her fingers twisting in her coat sleeve. She wanted to defend him, but felt paralyzed. She understood why they asked. She hated herself for understanding. When they were finally released, he stalked out without waiting for her, leaving her alone in the fluorescent-lit hallway with her thoughts. That evening, the command center remained lit like a small city in the school parking lot. Generators hummed, and spotlights cut through the cold darkness. Officers conferred over maps spread on the hoods of their cruisers, radios crackling with updates. Laura sat in a folding chair near the heater, feeling the numbness of the day settle in her chest. She watched the steam rise from a cup of coffee she could not bring herself to drink. She kept replaying the moment she last saw Emma, running along the fence, hair streaming behind her. She tried to remember if she had waved, if Emma had turned to look back, but the memory blurred each time she closed her eyes. As the night deepened, the search was called off again to resume at dawn. Volunteers were thanked and told to rest officers, giving them rides home if needed. Laura refused to leave until Mark returned to get her. He drove in silence, the heater blasting their red faces as they avoided looking at each other. She sat pressed to the door, fingers digging into the armrest. When they reached the house, it felt like trespassing, the warmth of the living room mocking them with its familiarity. Laura stood in the hallway, staring at the family photos for a long time, before moving toward Emma's empty bedroom. In Emma's room, the rainbow curtains swayed slightly in the draft from the old windows. The bed was neatly made, the way Laura insisted, with stuffed animals lined up like silent sentries. She sat on the edge of the mattress and let the weight of the day crush her chest until it felt hard to breathe. She picked up Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit and pressed it to her nose, inhaling the faint trace of her daughter's shampoo. The quiet was unbearable. Mark appeared in the doorway, but did not enter. They exchanged a hollow look before he turned away. Laura did not follow. The days turned into weeks as the search for Emma Riley transformed from frantic urgency into a routine of grim determination. Police continued to comb the woods and creek beds. Volunteers showed up daily to walk in widening circles through fields littered with fallen leaves and old bottles. Posters with Emma's smiling school photo curled in the damp cold on telephone poles, colors fading with each rainstorm that swept across Springfield. Laura watched the faces of neighbors and friends grow tight with pity, then with exhaustion, as people who had first promised to search until they dropped began returning to their lives. She felt betrayed, but also understood in a hollow, bitter way. Detectives stopped by the Riley house often in the first month, sitting at the kitchen table with steaming mugs of coffee they barely touched. Their questions shifted from logistical details to probing for any hidden family tensions. They asked Laura about discipline in the home. Emma's temperament, Mark's work hours. Laura tried to answer calmly, but felt her voice tremble with anger. She insisted Emma was a sweet girl who would not run away, that their marriage was strained, but not violent. Mark sat beside her in stony silence, hands folded tightly, jaw clenched until it ached. They rarely spoke outside those interviews, each blaming the other in unspoken accusations neither dared voice aloud. Winter arrived early that year, with sharp winds and crusts of ice on the sidewalks. Police resources thinned as other crimes demanded attention. The detective assigned to Emma's case stopped calling every day. Laura called his office repeatedly, leaving voicemails in a voice grown cracked and hoarse from crying. She spent hours scrolling forums for missing children, convinced she could find connections the professionals missed. She printed maps and pinned them to the walls of the dining room, marking possible routes and locations with bright stickers that felt garish in the gloom of the house. At night, she barely slept, listening for sounds outside the window, hoping without reason to hear Emma's voice calling for her. Mark began staying out later, telling Laura he could not stand the silence of the house, that he went for drinks with co-workers to numb the relentless ache in his chest. Laura accused him of abandoning her, of caring more about his own pain than Emma. He snapped back that he was the one the police interrogated like a suspect, forced to defend every moment of that day. They screamed at each other until their throats burned, then fell silent in mutual disgust and fear. Laura noticed the way Mark looked at her sometimes, as if he no longer recognized the woman he had married. She realized she probably looked the same way at him. Friends who had come by daily at first began calling less, offering hesitant invitations for coffee that Laura refused with clipped politeness. She could not face their kind eyes or whispered reassurances that sounded like shallow lies. She found herself avoiding the grocery store, embarrassed by the way people fell silent when she passed or touched her arm with too much sympathy. Instead, she ordered canned goods in bulk, letting them pile up in the kitchen, an ugly fortress against the outside world. When she did go out, she wore Emma's favorite scarf, pink and frayed, wrapped twice around her neck, so the familiar scent of her daughter's shampoo would fill her nose. In February, nearly 4 months after Emma's disappearance, the official search was suspended. Police announced at a press conference that all immediate leads had been exhausted, though the case remained open. Laura watched the broadcast alone in the living room, arms hugging her knees to her chest. The detective's carefully neutral voice felt like a betrayal, an admission of failure dressed up in bureaucracy. She hurled the remote at the wall where it cracked the paint and left a spiderweb fracture that she never bothered to repair. She sat for hours in the silence that followed, listening to the wind rattle the old windows. Mark packed a bag the next morning without warning. He told Laura he needed space, that he was suffocating in the house with Emma's empty room and the smell of her clothes in the closet. He refused to meet her eyes while he zipped the duffel shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. Laura followed him from room to room, begging in a voice that trembled and cracked. He did not answer, except to say he would send money for the bills. When he closed the door behind him, Laura felt the walls of the house close in like a trap. She sat on the bottom step of the staircase for hours, rocking back and forth, clutching Emma's stuffed rabbit so tightly the seams split. Spring arrived reluctantly in Springfield, with muddy lawns and pale green shoots pushing through the thawing ground. Emma's room remained untouched, the rainbow curtains fluttering in the warm breezes that Laura refused to block out. Dust settled on her dresser, where hair ties and crayons sat in arrested normalcy. Laura spent hours in that room, sitting in the child-sized chair, reading aloud the books Emma had loved, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined Emma curled in her lap, her head heavy on Laura's shoulder, the familiar weight she ached to feel again. Neighbors stopped asking after her, except for quick, awkward greetings at the mailbox. The town returned to routine in slow, guilty increments. Other children ran along the sidewalks to school with new backpacks and fresh haircuts. Parents held them tighter at first, but eventually relaxed. Laura watched it all with numb fury, resenting the way life moved on, as if Emma had never existed. She tried to cling to her anger because the alternative was unthinkable. She could not bear the cold space left in the world where her daughter had been the silence that rang in her ears every night as she lay awake wondering if Emma was dead or if she waited somewhere in the dark for her mother to come find her. The months that followed felt like a season that refused to end. Laura lived in the house alone most days, wandering from room to room in a haze of exhaustion. She kept the TV on constantly for the background noise, but she rarely watched anything except old home videos. The images were grainy, but clear enough to show Emma laughing in the backyard hair, tied in crooked pigtails, missing teeth flashing as she beamed at the camera. Laura would sit on the couch with a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, rewinding the same moments over and over until her eyes burned. She refused to pack away any of Emma's things, leaving her jacket hanging by the door and her shoes in the hall, like a promise that she would return. Mark did not come back after he left with his duffel. He texted a few times short messages about sending money for the mortgage and utilities. Laura did not reply, could not bring herself to say anything that would open the flood of rage and sorrow she felt every time she thought of him. They had been together for over a decade, a couple who had once shared everything from inside jokes to secret fears whispered in the dark. Now she felt as if she had been living with a stranger. She blamed him for leaving her alone in the worst moment of their lives, for abandoning the one person who still believed Emma was alive somewhere. The police visits slowed to a trickle. When detectives did call or stop by, Laura would answer questions mechanically face blank as she recited the same details she had offered dozens of times. She grew impatient with the way they danced around certain topics, their eyes flicking away when they mentioned Mark's name. One afternoon, a younger detective asked about their marriage in careful tones, trying to sound neutral. Laura felt her chest tighten with fury. She snapped that Mark was not capable of hurting Emma, that he loved her more than anything. The words tasted bitter even as she said them, because a part of her no longer believed them. Old fights replayed in Laura's mind late at night. She remembered how Mark had screamed at her in the hallway that she was not the only one grieving, that she needed to stop acting like he was the enemy. She remembered shoving him away, hearing his keys hit the floor, the metallic clatter that seemed to echo forever. She had watched him pick them up with shaking hands, eyes red-rimmed but cold, before he walked out. She thought about all the times he had turned away from her in bed, their backs pressed together like opposing walls. The silence that had festered for months before Emma vanished now felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Laura started drinking more heavily. She had always enjoyed a glass of wine in the evenings, but now she found herself finishing bottles alone, staring at the label while her vision blurred. She told herself it was the only way to sleep, the only way to quiet the endless loop of what-ifs and nightmares. She stopped answering calls from friends who still tried to check in, letting the phone ring until the voicemail picked up with Emma's recorded voice from years ago, bright and chirpy. Hearing that voice made her cry every time, but she refused to change it, refused to erase any part of Emma from the world. The house fell into disrepair around her. Dishes piled in the sink. Dust gathered on the furniture in thick layers. Laura ignored the bills that Mark sent money for letting them sit unopened on the counter. She forgot to take out the trash some weeks, the smell sharp and sour in the humid summer air. Neighbors started to avoid her gaze when she walked to the mailbox, pretending to check their phones or waving with uncomfortable smiles. She knew they talked about her behind closed doors, voices low with pity and judgment. She did not care anymore. She had no energy left for anything but survival. Mark called once late at night, his voice slurred and raw with alcohol. He said he had been thinking about Emma, that he missed her so much it felt like his ribs were breaking. Laura listened in silence, tears sliding down her face, unchecked. When he asked if she still believed Emma was alive, she could not answer. The silence on the line stretched until he finally hung up. She stared at the phone screen for a long time after wishing she could hate him completely, wishing she could forget how he used to make her laugh until she cried. Laura's family tried to intervene. Her sister drove in from Columbus to stay for a week, cooking meals and cleaning the house in tight-lipped frustration. They fought constantly, arguments that ended with slammed doors and ugly words Laura regretted the moment they left her mouth. Her sister finally left wiping tears from her eyes as she hugged Laura hard enough to bruise. She whispered that Emma would not want this, that Laura needed to keep living for her. Laura stood in the doorway watching her car drive away, arms wrapped around herself against the chill that had settled permanently in her bones. By the first anniversary of Emma's disappearance, the town had largely moved on. The school installed new security cameras and reinforced the playground fence. Teachers spoke of the incident in hushed tones, careful to avoid scaring the new students. Laura refused to attend the small vigil the PTA organized, furious that they treated it like an obligation to be checked off a list. She stayed home instead, sitting on Emma's bed with the stuffed animals arrayed like an audience. She read Emma's favorite story aloud in a shaking voice, pausing often to wipe her eyes. The words felt like lies. The years rolled forward with an indifferent cruelty that seemed to mock Laura's grief. By 2011, 5 years had passed since Emma's disappearance, but the ache never dulled. Laura lived alone in the small house that felt cavernous, without the sound of Emma's laughter or even the quiet presence of Mark. She kept her daughter's room untouched, visiting it daily like a shrine, touching the faded rainbow curtains and the stuffed rabbit that had gone limp with age. Sometimes she would sit on the floor with Emma's clothes in her lap, pressing them to her face, inhaling the stale scent of fabric softener and memory, until her chest hurt. The town of Springfield quietly forgot the rawness of the tragedy. Children who had been Emma's classmates graduated to middle school and then high school, their faces growing older, while Emma's photo remained frozen in time on the worn posters that still clung to bulletin boards and gas station windows. Laura watched those children walk home with backpacks slung carelessly over one shoulder and felt an acid jealousy in her throat. Their mothers waved from minivans, chatting about practice schedules and homework, their voices bright and carefree. She found herself hating them for having what she had lost, though she never said a word aloud. Mark visited exactly once in those years, showing up at the door unannounced one winter afternoon. He looked older, face-lined, and thinner hair gone mostly gray at the temples. They sat in the living room without speaking for nearly an hour, the silence between them so thick it seemed to smother the air. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with grief. He said he thought about Emma every day. Laura turned her head away, unable to look at him, the old anger rising in her chest. They did not fight this time. They simply existed side by side in the heavy quiet until Mark stood touching her shoulder gently before leaving without a backward glance. Detectives changed over the years. The first lead investigator retired, replaced by a younger man who tried to breathe new life into the cold case. He called Laura a few times, respectful but brisk, asking her to revisit the day Emma vanished. She felt drained every time, her memory eroded by time and the numbing fog of alcohol. She described the pink jacket, the light-up sneakers, the scrape on the fence latch that no one could explain. Each call ended with the detective promising to keep trying. Laura would hang up and stare at the wall, heart racing with old panic, wondering if she had forgotten something important that could have saved her daughter. Holidays were the worst. Laura stopped decorating entirely, leaving the boxes of lights and ornaments in the basement to gather dust. She ignored calls from her sister and declined invitations to holiday dinners, refusing to endure the false cheer or pitying glances. On Christmas mornings, she sat on Emma's bed with a wrapped gift in her lap, a tradition she could not let go, even though she had no one to give it to. Each year, she chose something Emma would have loved at 8, refusing to imagine her older or changed. She refused to let time take that from her, too. The house fell into a quiet disrepair that Laura barely noticed. The paint peeled in the bathroom. The porch steps sagged. Dandelions overtook the yard every spring, their yellow heads bright against the uncut grass. Laura's neighbors stopped offering to help. She saw them watching from behind curtains, their faces a mix of discomfort and relief, that they were not her. At night, she sat in the living room drinking cheap wine straight from the bottle, letting the TV play old sitcoms she did not really watch. She slept on the couch most nights, too tired or unwilling to climb the stairs to the empty bedroom she used to share with Mark. Rumors circulated in town, as rumors always do. Some people whispered that Laura must know more than she ever said. Others speculated that Mark had run off because he could not face what he had done. Laura heard these things in fragments through the grapevine of old friends and half-remembered conversations. She felt the words like dull knives in her back, but lacked the energy to respond. She had become a ghost in her own life, drifting from one day to the next on autopilot. She was waiting for something, anything that would give her permission to finally fall apart. Every so often, a tip would come in. A neighbor might claim to have seen a girl who looked like Emma in another town. A caller to the police hotline would insist she had been abducted and was living under a new name. Each time, Laura's heart would leap and crash with brutal speed. Detectives checked the tips dutifully, but none ever led anywhere. Laura learned not to answer the phone on those days, letting the voicemail pick up and deliver its cruel messages. She would listen later in the dark, clutching a pillow to her chest, knowing it would end in disappointment. By the 10th anniversary of Emma's disappearance, even the newspaper had stopped running yearly stories. There was no vigil planned that year, no prayer circle in the park. Laura stood at the kitchen window, watching the wind bend the trees in the yard, remembering the way Emma used to play among the fallen leaves. She felt the weight of those lost years pressing on her shoulders, the realization that she had lived an entire decade without hearing her daughter's voice or feeling her arms wrap around her neck. She did not cry that day. She simply closed her eyes and imagined Emma's laugh echoing one last time in the empty house. The fall of 2017 brought a new development that would crack open Laura's frozen world. A construction project behind Franklin Elementary had finally broken ground after years of debate in town meetings. Crews arrived with heavy machinery to clear the overgrown lot that bordered the playground. Weeds had swallowed old fence posts and brambles tangled around rusting beer cans and lost balls. Laura knew the place well in her mind, even though she never went near it anymore. It had always felt like sacred ground, a place she could not bear to see altered or forgotten. On a cold morning, a worker with a neon vest and mud-caked boots was using a shovel to clear stubborn roots along the edge of the new parking lot site. The soil turned up dark and wet, smelling of rot and autumn leaves. His shovel struck something soft that resisted. He frowned, kneeling to brush away the dirt with gloved fingers. A small canvas shoe emerged caked in black soil. The seam along the side split open, and the fabric discolored almost to gray. The man turned it over and saw letters written faintly inside the insole, the ink smeared but still legible enough to make out Emma R. He felt a chill, despite the work sweat cooling on his neck. Police arrived quickly, the site roped off with yellow tape fluttering in the wind. Laura heard about it before they even called her the town rumor mill, lighting up with frantic messages and cautious hope. When detectives finally contacted her, their voices trembled with a forced calm. They asked her to come down to the station. Laura sat in the cracked vinyl chair of the interview room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. An officer carefully placed the evidence bag on the table between them, the shoe inside visible through the cloudy plastic. Laura stared at it without speaking for nearly a minute, her fingers curling into her coat until her knuckles turned white. She could not deny it. It was Emma's shoe. She remembered buying them on sale at the department store, Emma trying them on in the aisle, bouncing from foot to foot with delight, because they were the ones with little sparkles in the fabric. She remembered writing her name inside in permanent marker so it would not get lost at school. The sight of it now torn and filthy felt like someone had punched her in the chest. Laura finally looked up at the detective with eyes gone glassy, her voice cracking as she whispered that it was hers. She could not say Emma's name out loud. The news spread like wildfire in Springfield. Reporters swarmed the elementary school fence again, shoving microphones at anyone who would speak. Parents pulled their children closer as they walked by the old lot, their faces tight with fear and something like guilt for having forgotten. The local paper ran a front-page story with a photo of the construction site, lit by floodlights, crime scene tape stark against the dark. They recycled Emma's school picture one more time, the same bright smile and chipped tooth that had haunted the town for over a decade. Laura did not read the article. She did not turn on the TV. She sat at home in silence, listening to the phone ring unanswered. The police launched a new investigation with fresh urgency. Forensic teams sifted the soil around the discovery site with careful hands, digging in grids and collecting samples in clear plastic bags. They found no bones, no clothing besides the shoe, no clear evidence of a body ever being there. But there was one undeniable truth. Tests confirmed the blood on the torn canvas matched Emma's. The stain was small, faded with time, but enough for DNA to speak in its cold certainty. Laura sat in the station again, hearing those words in a monotone voice, feeling her ears buzz as the world tilted around her. She stumbled out of the station and sat on the front steps for nearly an hour, clutching her knees and rocking back and forth as cars drove past without slowing. Memories slammed into her in brutal flashes. Emma running across the playground, shrieking with laughter. Emma crying when she scraped her knee. Emma asleep in her bed, clutching that stuffed rabbit tight. Laura felt a scream rise in her throat, but swallowed it back down, pressing her lips together until they went numb. She stood shakily and walked home, refusing rides from well-meaning neighbors who did not know what to say. Mark called her that evening. Laura stared at the screen until it went dark. She could not bring herself to answer, imagining his voice breaking on the other end, knowing he would blame himself again or worse, try to comfort her. She wanted to tell him about the shoe, about the blood, about how it felt like losing Emma all over again. But she could not. She turned the phone off completely and let it fall to the carpet. She sat in Emma's room until dawn, rocking in the child-sized chair, the light from the street lamp outside casting long bars across the walls. That week, she went to the construction site alone. The workers had been sent home the project on indefinite hold. Yellow tape still fluttered in the wind. She stepped over it without hesitation, boots sinking into the churned mud. Laura stood in the middle of the clearing, staring at the patch of earth where they had found the shoe. She knelt carefully, pressing her palm to the cold soil, eyes closing, as tears slid down her cheeks unchecked. She whispered apologies into the wind voice cracking, telling Emma she was sorry she had not been there, that she had not kept looking hard enough. The discovery of the shoe forced the police to treat Emma's case with fresh urgency. The department assigned new detectives who had not worked the original investigation, hoping fresh eyes might see what had been missed. They spread maps and old notes across long tables in the station basement, the air musty with years of forgotten files. Photographs of Emma smiled from bulletin boards next to blurry pictures of the old fence line and grainy shots of the playground. Detectives reread every witness statement, paying special attention to the old mention of a suspicious scrape on the latch of the fence. They argued quietly about theories, while coffee grew cold in their styrofoam cups. Laura found herself back in the station's stale interview rooms, the same smell of disinfectant in the air. She sat in a metal chair while the new Ludd detective asked her to walk through everything one more time. Her hands trembled as she described Emma's pink jacket and the way she always ran too fast on the blacktop, her voice cracking when she spoke of hearing the laughter stop. The detective took notes without interrupting, nodding slowly. He asked if anyone had ever followed them, or if Emma had seemed afraid of anyone. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. She felt a hot wave of guilt wash over her for not seeing anything, for not protecting her little girl. Detectives revisited old leads that had been dismissed years earlier. They tracked down former teachers and playground aides, now scattered across different towns or retired. Cynthia, the young recess aide who had been on duty that day, sat in her own living room clutching a mug of tea as she described how quickly Emma had vanished. She cried when she talked about the guilt that had never left her. She confessed that she sometimes had dreams where she turned around faster and caught someone reaching over the fence. The detective wrote every word carefully, eyes somber but patient, gently probing for any new detail that might have slipped her memory. Police also called in several of Emma's old classmates, now young adults with tired faces and lives of their own. Most barely remembered that day beyond the confusion and fear. One young man sat with hunched shoulders in the station, rubbing his palms on his jeans, his voice cracking as he admitted he might have seen something strange. He hesitated, and then described a man standing outside the fence talking to Emma. He remembered the man had worn a brown jacket and had scruffy hair, but he could not see his face clearly. The detective pressed gently for more, but the memory blurred with time and fear fading before it could become truly useful. Laura was told about this new lead, but warned not to put too much hope in it. She listened numbly, her fingers twisting in her lap. She tried to imagine Emma standing there, chatting with a stranger, her big, trusting eyes blinking up at him. The image made her stomach turn. She could not help but blame herself for letting Emma walk to the playground alone while she sat in the car thinking about errands and work. She spent long nights at home sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, replaying that memory over and over, whispering apologies into the darkness until her voice gave out. The investigation dug deeper into background checks for known offenders living nearby at the time. They found several men with records for violent crimes against children who had since moved or died. The files grew thicker, with printouts and mugshots, most of them marked with scribbled notes about dead ends. One suspect had died in a car crash years earlier. Another had an airtight alibi proven by payroll records and security cameras from his job. Detectives felt the old frustration setting in, but forced themselves to keep going, unwilling to let the case slip back into the cold files. Laura watched the news crews appear outside her house again, their vans humming in the street. She kept her blinds drawn, but heard them talking on the lawn, voices rehearsed and neutral as they reported on the renewed investigation. She refused to give any interviews this time, sick of strangers picking over her grief for a headline. Instead, she sat in Emma's room, the stuffed animals arrayed along the bed in silent witness, feeling the heaviness in her chest settle like lead. She pressed her forehead to the edge of the bed, fingers digging into the worn comforter, whispering to Emma that she would not stop. As weeks turned into months, the investigation hit walls again and again. The memory of that classmate could not be sharpened into an ID. No one could explain how the shoe had ended up buried in a place that had been searched before. The scrape on the latch offered no fingerprints after so many years. DNA on the shoe was Emma's and no one else's. The detectives found themselves staring at the same maps late into the night lines, and pins forming the same patterns that had haunted the department for a decade. They called Laura often to update her, their voices tight with frustration, and the weight of responsibility they felt pressing on them. Laura listened carefully to every call, nodding even when they could not see her. She took notes in a battered notebook with Emma's name written in large letters on the cover. She refused to let them hear her voice break, saving her tears for after she hung up. She had nothing else left to do but hope that they would keep looking. Every morning she woke up with a sick feeling in her stomach, checking the phone first thing to see if there was news. Every night she sat by the window watching the shadows in the yard, imagining Emma running up the walk and throwing herself into her arms. As the investigation dragged on without resolution, the detectives turned toward questions about people closest to the family. Laura felt the dread rising in her chest when they asked her about Mark again, their voices carefully neutral but insistent. She remembered the way he had snapped at her in the early days, how he had walked out and never really returned. She tried to defend him at first, saying he was grieving too, but their faces stayed serious. One detective asked about his work records on the day Emma vanished. Laura realized she did not know every detail anymore, and that hurt in ways she could not explain. Mark was living in Kentucky now, renting a small duplex with peeling paint and sagging gutters. He worked at a garage long hours that left him smelling of oil and sweat. He received the call from the Springfield police late on a humid evening, the phone pressed tight to his ear as the detective asked him to come in for questioning. Mark agreed without arguings, but spent the entire night sitting on the edge of his bed staring at the floor. He tried to remember that day in 2006, tried to piece together hours that had become fractured memories colored by guilt and loss. He rubbed his temples until his skin felt raw. When Mark sat in the interrogation room, he looked worn down, his hair thinner, and gray stubble dark on his jaw. The detectives laid out old photos and timelines in front of him. They asked about the 20-minute gap in his alibi, the day Emma vanished, how he had signed out for lunch at work, but had no receipts, no witnesses. Mark bristled at first, voice rising in frustration, then dropped his head into his hands. He breathed hard, fingers digging into his scalp. He admitted he had not been honest about everything back then, that he had left work to drive around thinking about bills and his failing marriage. He said he had not wanted to look like a bad husband or father, so he lied about grabbing food. The room fell silent for a moment after he spoke. The detective's pen hovered over the paper, waiting. Mark kept talking, voice cracking, as he remembered a man he had hired a few times for odd jobs, a drifter who did yard work cheap, and who had a rough look about him. He could not remember if he had seen the man that day, but he admitted he had lied to Laura about knowing him well. He said he had felt ashamed, afraid it would look bad, afraid people would think he had brought danger to their door. His shoulders shook with the effort of saying it out loud. The detectives exchanged a quiet look. They pulled out old records and asked if the man's name was Ronald Tate. Mark's face crumpled when he heard it nodding slowly, as tears welled in his eyes. Ronald Tate had been arrested in another state for attempted assault on a minor years before Emma vanished, but had been released and drifted around. Police realized that Tate had moved to Indiana in 2007 and died in 2011, a heart attack in a cheap rented room. The files on him had never been cross-referenced properly back then. The thought of a dead suspect left everyone in the room with a hollow feeling. Laura was told about this confession in a meeting at the station. She sat frozen in the plastic chair, fingers digging into her purse strap. The detective's voice sounded muffled in her ears as he explained that Mark had lied about hiring Tate. Laura remembered the name, an old conversation where Mark had brushed off questions about who did yard work. She pressed her lips together, feeling sick. The betrayal stung sharply, the realization that he had kept something so important buried under shame, or fear, or simple selfishness. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had not told her why he had let her rot in that house, thinking she had failed their daughter alone. Mark returned to Springfield for the first time in years to sit down with Laura. They met in the dim lobby of the police station, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid. Laura refused to look at him at first, staring at the floor with her jaw set. Mark tried to explain, voice low and shaking, that he had been scared, that he did not want her to see him as the one who brought the monster to their yard. He said he had wanted to protect her from that truth. Laura let out a harsh laugh that turned into a sob, accusing him of protecting himself instead. They argued in low voices that turned harsh and biting. Mark finally fell silent, head bowed, tears sliding down his lined face. Laura wiped her eyes angrily, refusing to let him see her break down. The detectives watched from a distance, trying to give them space, but knowing this was as much a part of the case as any fingerprint or interview. The two of them had carried so much guilt and anger that it had twisted everything between them until they were strangers. Laura stood first, grabbing her coat and walking out without looking back. Mark did not try to follow. Afterward, Laura sat in her car, the steering wheel cold under her fingers. She pressed her forehead to it, breathing in ragged gasps. She remembered Emma's laugh, the way she would hug so hard her little arms would shake. She remembered every fight with Mark, every slammed door, every silence that had settled like dust. She thought about Ronald Tate, a man she had never met, but whose shadow had destroyed her life. She wanted answers that would never come. She wanted her daughter back. She whispered that she was sorry, over and over, voice barely a breath in the cold, dark car. Detectives refused to let the case go, even with Tate dead. They dug into records, piecing together his movements over the years with grim determination. They found old rental agreements, gas receipts, and scraps of notes from landlords who described him as sullen, secretive, and always behind on rent. They traced his last known address to a crumbling one-story house in rural Indiana where he had lived alone. The property had changed hands twice since his death, but the current owner agreed to let police search. A team arrived with boxes of files and evidence bags, their boots crunching over dead leaves as they approached the sagging porch that groaned under their weight. Inside the house, the air was stale and thick with mildew. Peeling wallpaper curled away from water-stained walls. Detectives methodically swept each room, taking photographs and notes, pushing aside rotting furniture and old newspapers. In the back, they found a shed nailed shut with rusted boards. It took crowbars and patience to break it open. Dust billowed out in choking clouds. Inside sat old boxes and a metal cabinet streaked with rust. One officer shone his flashlight around and froze. Against the wall lay a small, rusted trunk with a lock broken long ago. He reached down with gloved hands, heart thudding. They carried the trunk out onto the brittle grass where the air was clearer. Carefully, they pried it open. The contents were sad and horrifying. Small hair clips with faded colors, a child's bracelet with cracked plastic beads, scraps of dirty clothing that had been folded but stained with age and filth. The officers felt their stomachs turn. They cataloged each item with photographs marking them for evidence bags. Every piece was bagged and labeled in silence except for the scratch of pens on forms. In the silence of the yard, one detective muttered that it looked like trophies. Another simply shook his head, refusing to speak. When Laura was told about the trunk, she felt her legs buckle. She sank into a chair at the station, her fingers pressed against her lips as if to hold back a scream. The detective's voice was calm but unsteady as he described the items they had found. He said they could not be sure any belonged to Emma yet, but they would run DNA tests. Laura stared at the floor, seeing her daughter's hair, her bright beads she used to string on shoelaces. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to cry in front of them. She asked only if they would test everything, voice hoarse and low. The lab took weeks to process the evidence. The waiting nearly broke Laura. She sat in Emma's room every evening, the soft light catching dust motes in the air. She turned over her daughter's clothes in her lap, imagining the dirty scraps sitting in sterile evidence bags somewhere under fluorescent lights. She whispered Emma's name over and over, the words like a prayer and a promise. She forced herself to answer calls from detectives who could only say they were working as quickly as possible. She thanked them mechanically, her voice flat with exhaustion. When the results came back, it confirmed Laura's worst fears. A hair clip from the trunk matched Emma's DNA. The detective could not keep the tremor from his voice as he told her. He explained gently that other items appeared to belong to different children whose identities they might never confirm. Laura felt a cold numbness settle over her as she listened. She wanted to scream at him to stop talking, but she stayed silent. She thought of Emma wearing that clip in her hair the morning she disappeared, how she had fussed with it in the mirror, wanting it to look perfect. The town reacted to the news with hushed horror. Parents pulled their children closer, even those who had been toddlers when Emma vanished. The local paper ran another front-page story, the headline stark and solemn. Candlelight vigils sprang up again, smaller than before, but heartfelt. Laura did not attend any of them. She could not stand the thought of people watching her with pity or grief that would fade when they went home to their safe, whole families. She stayed in Emma's room, instead holding the stuffed rabbit so tightly the seams split. Police closed in on the final timeline. Tate had been in Springfield the year Emma vanished, working odd jobs for cash, sleeping in his truck, or crashing in cheap motels. He had slipped through the original investigation because of bureaucratic errors, his prior offenses filed under an alias. The new detectives felt the bitterness of that failure deep in their bones. They built a case anyway, knowing it would never see trial. They filed reports, marked evidence, wrote closure memos in solemn silence. They told Laura they would classify Emma's death as a homicide by an unknown assailant, but would note Tate as the prime suspect. She nodded slowly, her eyes empty, absorbing the words as if they were in another language. Laura found herself walking the old playground one evening, the wind cold on her cheeks. The fence had been replaced, but she could still see the spot where Emma vanished. She pressed her hand against the metal, feeling it vibrate with the wind. She closed her eyes and let the memories come. Emma's laugh, her small hand in hers, the way she would throw her arms around her neck without warning. Laura stood there until the sun set and the shadows swallowed the swings. She whispered that she was sorry, that she should have seen that she would never stop loving her. Laura sat at her kitchen table in the pale light of early morning, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The quiet in the house felt thicker than ever, pressing against her ribs like a weight she could not shift. Outside the window, the street was empty, except for wind stirring fallen leaves across the cracked pavement. She watched them tumble and swirl, remembering the way Emma used to stomp through piles of them, laughing and shrieking with delight. That memory both comforted her and scraped raw at something inside her chest. She sipped the bitter drink without tasting it, her eyes dry from too many sleepless nights. The detectives had closed the case officially 2 weeks earlier. They had sat her down in the station, voices low and careful, explaining that while Ronald Tate was dead and could never be tried, they were listing the case as homicide by an unknown assailant with Tate named the prime suspect. They explained the process in clinical terms, describing the paperwork and evidence logs. Laura listened without interrupting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wanted to scream at them to stop using words that sanitized what had happened, to stop calling it closure when there could never be any. But she said nothing. When they asked if she understood, she nodded once, swallowing the lump in her throat so hard it hurt. Since then, she had gone through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. She moved from room to room without purpose, straightening things that did not need straightening, washing dishes she would only dirty again, folding blankets no one used. Emma's room remained untouched. The bed was still made with the faded comforter patterned with cartoon animals, the stuffed animals arranged in neat rows along the pillow. Laura would stand in the doorway for long stretches, hands dangling at her sides, her heart thudding with a dull ache. She could not bring herself to pack anything away. It felt like admitting Emma was gone forever, something her mind refused to accept, even with the evidence laid out so cruelly in front of her. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail from the county. It was a notice offering grief counseling, along with a printed list of resources for victims of violent crime. Laura read it at the table, the words blurring and doubling in her vision. She crumpled it in her hand and dropped it into the trash without a sound. She knew no counselor could give her what she wanted. They could not give her back the nights of reading stories with Emma snuggled against her side. They could not give her back the sound of small feet running through the house, the smell of shampoo and freshly washed hair, the warmth of a little body falling asleep in her arms. She sat for a long time staring at the trash can, wondering if she should retrieve the letter. But she did not move. Mark called twice in those weeks, leaving voicemails she could not bear to listen to all the way through. His voice cracked as he tried to say he was sorry again, to tell her he missed Emma too, that he wished he had done things differently. Laura deleted the messages with trembling fingers. She could not hear his regret without feeling like her skin would split open. She knew he was broken too, but the anger still sat in her gut like a stone. She thought about the way he had lied, about the way he had left her alone in that house with her guilt and fear. She was not sure she could ever forgive him, even if she wanted to. The town of Springfield adjusted with that awkward hush that follows tragedy. The newspaper ran one last story, summarizing the case, and its conclusion ending with a photo of Emma that Laura could not stand to look at anymore. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now offered tight smiles or small nods when they saw her gestures that meant well, but felt hollow. She walked to the mailbox each day, with her head down, avoiding conversations she had no energy to navigate. She felt like a remnant of something the town wanted to forget, but could not quite scrape away. On a cold October day, almost exactly 11 years after Emma had disappeared, Laura decided she could not stay inside any longer. She put on her coat and wrapped Emma's old pink scarf around her neck, the one with frayed edges that still smelled faintly of fabric softener, and the ghost of shampoo. She walked slowly through town, her breath forming pale clouds in the air, her boots scuffed against uneven sidewalks. She did not have a destination in mind, only the need to keep moving to stop the walls of the house from pressing in on her. Eventually, she found herself standing outside Franklin Elementary. The new fence gleamed with fresh paint, taller and sturdier than the old one. Children played inside, their shouts and laughter carried on the wind. Laura watched them through the bars, her chest tight. She saw teachers watching carefully, scanning the yard with practiced eyes. She remembered Emma running along this same blacktop, her hair streaming behind her, her laugh so clear and bright that it made Laura's heart squeeze. She pressed her gloved hand to the fence, feeling the cold bite through the fabric. A teacher noticed her standing there and offered a small wave, wary but polite. Laura nodded once in return, unable to trust her voice. She watched the children run and stumble and pick themselves up, their faces flushed with cold and excitement. She felt a surge of fierce, aching hope that they would all go home safely that night, that their mothers would wrap them in blankets and scold them for muddy shoes, that they would fall asleep without fear. She let her hand slide down the fence and stepped back, slowly, eyes shining with unshed tears. When she turned to leave, she noticed another mother waiting at the corner for her own child. Their eyes met briefly. Laura offered a small nod, and for the first time in years it felt genuine. The other woman returned it, shifting her weight nervously, but holding Laura's gaze. In that moment, Laura felt something crack inside her, not in the way of breaking, but in the way of thawing. She realized she was not alone in her fear or her love. She walked home slowly, the cold wind against her face, sharp but honest. That night, Laura sat in Emma's room for a long time. She traced the patterns on the comforter with her fingers. She spoke out loud in a voice that trembled but did not break. She told Emma she loved her, that she always would. She promised she would try to keep going, that she would try to be the mother Emma deserved, even if she was not there to see it. She pressed her hand to her heart and closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her without fighting them. She felt them settle around her like a blanket, heavy but warm. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear what you think about the plot and where you are watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation.